Okay, guys, we're going to go through some notes here for Chapter 7.4. Part 4 of the 1920s talks about the mass culture that was starting to take shape. So when we think of mass culture, we're thinking of things along the lines of leisure activities, entertainment. So this is the section of Chapter 7 where we'll be looking at, the advent of the radio and popular sports and popular entertainers of the day. Movies comes to mind. Okay, this is the period when silent movies become movies with sound. So everything that is part of pop culture, really, of the 1920s is what we'll be looking at. I also included then a live link again in the folder for today, Friday, on Schoology. There will be some videos again in this lecture that you will need to pause me during this lecture. You'll need to go and watch those. And just like the last ones, they are going to be beneficial. They will do you good. And you will need to watch those for sure. There's going to be three sets I think 2 or 3 videos for this lecture that'll cover a couple of different topics. Radio and Babe Ruth, for example, or sports in general are just a couple, to name a few. So let's get going here. Some of the key objectives for this lecture for 7.4, you're going to want to know for the test how and to what extent did leisure time increase during the 1920s. And you want to be able to explain, in case you see this on a short answer question, the reasons why leisure time increased during the decade. What was it that gave people more time to enjoy activities like going to a baseball game or what have you. You also want to be able to analyze how pop culture was developed or how it developed over the decade, and really how did this new pop culture unite Americans together through the new activities that they were enjoying, whether it be music, we know this was the jazz age, or if it was going to a baseball game, or if it was listening to this new thing called the radio, and who were some of their pop culture heroes, like a Babe Ruth, or Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in a solo transatlantic flight, right? So these people became cultural heroes to a lot of other people. You also want to talk about what advancements women made during the 1920s, including gaining the right to vote in 1920, we know. And also using this term modernism that we talked about in the last lecture, and how this concept of modernism, how it was used and how it impacted writers, the big writers of the day, like your F. Scott Fitzgeralds and Ernest Hemingways and those people, and the painters of the 1920s. In other words, how did those themes of modernism come through in many of the books they wrote or the paintings that they created? So one of the key questions here, as we look at the first part of this section 4, is how did this newfound pop culture reflect the technological and social changes of the decade? We've talked about some of these technological changes before, and some of the social changes that have been taking place. We know that there was an increase in tension and conflict between primarily the rural parts of the country and the urban parts of the country. And we said in the last lecture that there were a number of events that took place and showed how that conflict was being manifested in these certain events, like the Scopes monkey trial and whatnot. So one of the things we want to look at here is, like we did in the first section, is the role of the automobile. The automobile, we know, made it much easier for people to travel, to go from point A to point B. But there were more technological innovations than just the automobile. The automobile arguably was the most significant. But you also had things like this, like this new invention called the radio, and people using the radio to listen to their favorite shows on the radio, right? You have to remember, there was no television in the 1920s. So between radio and film, movies, silent movies, until about 1927, these two really formed what was known as mass media, and they made up the mass culture. There are also new styles that emerged in art and literature as well. But for the 1920s was considered the decade of the first modern decade, the first modern era. There were many cultural issues that divided Americans. We know that from different regions of the country, making up different economic classes. But the technology that started to come through in the 20s really kind of broke down those barriers and eased some of the conflict and tension in society. And we had the growth of the cities. The growth of the cities changed the way people lived and the patterns in which people lived, and it changed the way how people enjoyed their leisure time. Especially it happened on the farm too, in rural parts of the country, but the cities were a little bit different. Work hours per week started to change. People started to work less. I think your book talks about how people worked roughly 70 hours a week from about 1850 to 1855 all the way up to 1910. But then those hours started to really be sliced almost in half. The average work week was about a 45-hour work week by 1930. And technology had a lot to do with that. Okay, and you can see the second point here. For a lot of people, their daily life started to change. And like I said, this became known as the first modern era. Okay, and while people were working less, of course, people were also earning more. Salaries started to rise, and their wages, if you were an hourly worker, wage worker, those also started to rise. So, like I mentioned in the previous slide, during the 1920s, especially if you lived in the cities, urban livers saw their increase in leisure time really started to go up. And like I mentioned earlier, that's because largely the typical work week in hours started to go down. And life in the city and the country became very much different when you compared the two. If you lived on the farm, farm work typically was done from dawn until the sun went down. So there was very little time for recreation and leisure activity. And if you recall my previous lecture from part 3, I did mention that people who lived in the rural parts of the country tended to miss out on a lot of the new leisure activities and entertainment that the country was going through. But if you lived in the cities and even the suburbs, people were earning more income, they were earning more in wages, therefore they had more time for fun, they had the money to experience the more fun things, the entertainment, the movies, the radio, and whatnot, and they also looked for other new kinds of entertainment, and those would play out as the decade wore on. And one of the new kinds of entertainment, of course, was the film or the movie. Now, films were silent. They were silent films until 1927. And with more free time on people's hands and more disposable income, people in really the suburbs, suburban America, started to flock toward the motion picture. And one thing to keep in mind, too, is that the technology to make a film had been around for about 25 years. So it wasn't like, people just all of a sudden figured out how to make a movie in 1920. That had been around since about 1900. Okay. There were a large number of huge Hollywood studios dating back prior to 1920. But it was during the 20s that millions and millions of people started to flock toward theaters to see silent movies or silent films. And it was by 1927, like I said, when the first film with sound came out. Okay. The one advantage that silent films had compared to ones with sound is, of course, people could watch them no matter what language they spoke. So what they would do is, and I have a sample of a silent film clip here in the video that I'll have you pause me for so you can go watch it, is they would show the people talking, right? There's no sound, and then they would put the words up on the screen. So it was kind of like a delayed closed captioning is what was going on. Motion pictures became kind of an art for many people. They were different than theatrical productions or concerts. Movies were available to anyone with just a few cents to spare. Those other forms of entertainment, like the theater and going to classical concerts, tended to be more for people who could afford to go. They were for the well-to-do. There were a lot of stars during the movie age, the silent movie age. We'll talk about one here in a moment. His name was Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was by far the most popular silent film star. And there were others too, Rudolph Valentino and William Hart, and there were many of them. Okay, like I mentioned before, movies were affordable and very widely available to a lot of people. And this made them arguably very democratic, right? The more something is available to a wide variety of people, we say the more democratic it is. It had universal appeal. The movies created movie stars, what seemed like overnight, and like I said, the most popular was Charlie Chaplin. He played a role called the Little Tramp, and he made dozens and dozens of silent films. By 1927, history was made when the first movie with sound came out. Movies with sound were known as talkies, and this was the first time that the action that you saw on the screen and what you heard in the words were synchronized together. And I suppose it'd be similar to when people were around back in the mid-90s, like when I was first experiencing this thing called the internet and being able to send a message or send an email right to someone else. We were just amazed at how that worked. How did the other person receive that message? Or when TV was first invented, when people saw what was going on the TV screen, how were those people inside that box able to do that, right? Same with people in the 20s. How are they able to coordinate the sound, what people were saying, with what people were doing on the screen? Well, the jazz singer was the first to do that. Starring Al Jolson, who was a popular entertainer, singer, jazz singer at the time, and actor. And this really kind of put an end, of course, to the era of silent films. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to pause me, and I'd like you to find in the folder, in the Week 8 folder for today, Friday, find the live Google link that's entitled Chapter 7.4 Notes, and watch the video. The video is going to look like this. It's going to be the silent film, a clip from the silent film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You notice it's from 1912. This is an extremely famous silent film. And you don't need to watch the whole thing. Just watch a few minutes of it, just enough to get a sense of how the silent film worked. Okay? So pause me now, and then we'll come back and continue. Okay, thanks guys for pausing me. I hope you enjoyed that clip of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That movie's been made many, many times, but the original, now you know the original, was in a silent motion picture format. So I hope you enjoyed that. Continuing on with this thing called mass culture. One of the biggest innovations, the most significant innovations of the day, of course, was the radio. And right behind it, arguably, was the phonograph. Okay? The phonograph was just another name for a record player. And these two inventions really broke barriers when it came to inventions. All right, so like movies, the record player or the phonograph and the radio, both of them became really powerful instruments of this new pop culture that was starting to take place. Each was the result of technological advances of the day, and just business people knowing how to use them and to promote them in society. Millions of radios, millions of phonographs, as well as records, were bought and sold during the 1920s. And this would be the primary way that people would listen to, for example, music on a record, all the way up until about the mid-80s, early to mid-80s, when the first compact discs, CDs, would start to come out. Okay? What these two did, what the radio and phonograph did, is they really helped to produce a culture that was much more standardized, right? So in other words, Americans in the East or Americans in the West, North, South, it didn't matter, listened to the same songs, they would learn the same dances. They were able to do this because they all shared the same pop culture now, okay? The radio, sometimes known as the wireless, was developed actually in the 1890s. By Giuliano Marconi. He was the Italian, actually, who was credited with inventing the radio. But by the 1920s, the radio had been an invention for a small group of military technicians. They were the people who were using it the most. It was actually the U.S. military, or telephone operators, or radio operators. But by 1920, KDKA was the first commercial radio station that actually used the radio on a commercial basis. So for shows, for music, and they also broadcast the 1920 presidential election. That's the one that President Harding won. They broadcast the results to that election. So that was groundbreaking stuff. And within about 3 years, there were 600,000 radio sets that were sold, 600,000 radios, and over 600 radio stations had been built. So I can tell that shows you right there the popularity and the demand for the radio. And like I said, people all over the country could listen now to the same music, educational lectures, religious sermons, from churches, get their weather report, all that good stuff. And for the first time, they were able to listen to commercials also on the radio. The phonograph allowed people to listen to music whenever they wanted, right? The record player, they could throw on their favorite record, their favorite artist, and listen to a record. And the improvements in this kind of technology made records very, very popular. And now people could listen to the same songs and learn the same dances as it didn't matter. So in other words, it cut across geographic boundaries, demographic boundaries all across the country. People very much used things like the radio to listen to their favorite sports broadcast. For example, many Americans who were fans of boxing listened to the heavyweight championship boxing match between Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey, 1927. So these two were groundbreaking innovations, right? And we already had the automobile, and that served a little bit different role. But the radio and phonograph were certainly the leading innovations in terms of pop culture. Okay, a lot of these things started in the urban settings of the country, and then kind of over time filtered their way to the rural parts of the country. So what I'd like you to do now is pause me, and what you're going to do is go back to the Google Slides and listen to. You're going to play this video. It's in the form of a video, but what you're going to be listening to is the actual recording of the first radio broadcast that was done by KDKA out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1920. It'll just be a couple minutes. So pause me now, and then we'll come back and continue. Okay, thanks guys. Hopefully you enjoyed that broadcast. That's really cool stuff that they were able to save that and preserve that broadcast. That's now 100 years old. You really don't get much better than that. And if you weren't able to make out the entire broadcast because of the audio, that just goes to show you, right, 1920 the audio wasn't greatest, at least by our standards, but in 1920 it was pretty darn cool. So in addition to Hollywood, you also had pop culture heroes, or these people who were kind of bigger or larger than life, either in their respective sport or what they stood for, what they symbolized. The world of sports, I think, tended to produce some of the more famous heroes during the 1920s, and it was things like newspapers, right, the mass media, radio, movies, that millions and millions of Americans could follow their favorite hero, or in this case, their favorite athlete. And there wasn't any athlete bigger. Some would even argue today that Babe Ruth was still one of the most popular, if not the most popular athlete ever. He certainly was during the 1920s. He was nicknamed the Sultan of SWAT. He was the larger-than-life figure for the New York Yankees because of his ability to hit home runs. And like I said, because of the increased readership with newspapers and radio coverage, the New York Yankees were the team to watch in the 1920s, because baseball was becoming and was the most popular sport. And it was men like Babe Ruth who made baseball such a popular sport. Other sports heroes would include men like Red Grange, who was a popular running back playing professional football. You had Jack Dempsey, the heavyweight champion of the world in boxing. You had Bobby Jones. Golf was taking off. Bobby Jones was the world famous amateur player. He was arguably the best golfer in the world at the time. And then you had Bob Tilden, who was the man to beat in tennis. So tennis was very popular too. So there are any number of sports, but it was largely Babe Ruth when it came to sports. You also had people like Gertrude Ederle, who was the first woman to swim across the English Channel. You had men like Charles Lindbergh, like I mentioned earlier, who was the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in a single transatlantic flight. The reason that sports became so popular, and this kind of became the golden age of sports, is because what went along with it was this new reporter known as the sports writer. And what the sports writer did, working for papers, especially newspapers, is they were able to capture the excitement of sports, right? And the excitement of players like Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey and Bobby Jones. And they would turn these athletes basically by writing about them and following them basically into, like an immortal god of sorts. And, it was nicknames, the Sultan of SWAT and whatnot. Those came from sports writers, right? And that's how they became kind of these larger than life figures. And the other reason why is you got to remember during the 1920s, this was a period following World War I. And World War I had shattered many Americans' faith and trust in progress, making the world seem very cheap and very flawed. And what these people did, sports writers and whatnot, made these other athletes and other figures like Lindbergh and Gertrude Ederle, they made them heroes, basically reassuring Americans that people were and Americans were capable of great things, great feats. So this really started to come through in the 1920s. So what I'd like you to do now is pause me and watch this short clip. It's about 4 minutes. It's a short little clip on a short little biography of Babe Ruth, one of the main cultural icons or figures of the 1920s. So pause me now. Okay, guys, welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed that little clip on Babe Ruth. You get a good sense of who he was. You probably don't have to be a baseball expert or guru to, who have heard of Babe Ruth before. Of course, another big star of the day was Charles Lindbergh, and I've mentioned his name a couple of different times already. During the 1920s, the early 20s, the airline industry was pretty much in its infancy. The Wright brothers, remember, got their plane up in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903. So we're only talking about 17, 20 years down the road, right? By the time Lindbergh came around in 1927. There had been flying aces, right, in World War I. The fighter plane, the fighter pilot was a new invention of war during World War I. But it really wasn't used as, for commercial aircraft like what Lindbergh would use it for. So in May of 27, he takes off from Long Island, New York, in his plane called the Spirit of St. Louis, and he flew nonstop, 33 hours from Long Island, New York to Paris, and he was the first human being to do this. And other pilots had flown across the Atlantic Ocean before, but Lindbergh was the first to do it solo by himself, nonstop. So he had to, of course, load that plane down with enough gasoline to get him across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris safely. And he had to stay awake that whole time as well. So when he landed in Paris, of course, he became an instant media celebrity, nicknamed by writers Lucky Lindy and Lone Eagle and all different kinds of nicknames. And upon returning back home to the United States in New York, he was welcomed with a ticker tape parade and this huge triumphant return back to the United States. And Lindbergh is a Minnesotan. He's from the Midwest. He's from northern Minnesota. So one of Minnesota's own became a national hero for many people during the 1920s. Okay, so what I'd like to have you do now, again, is pause me. And what I'd like to do is have you watch this little clip that shows Lindbergh's flight. Gives you a little description about Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. Pause me now, and then we'll continue when you get back. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed the clip there on Charles Lindbergh. One other major change that started to take place during the 20s is the role of women started to change in the 20s. During what was known as the Victorian Age, that was the age during the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was the age of progressivism. It was during that time when we were talking about the Spanish-American War, right, and right around the late Industrial Revolution. That was known as the Victorian Age. Well, during that time, women had been expected to center their lives on the home and the family. That started to change in the 1920s. What was known as the new woman of the 20s was more liberated. Women started to get married later in life. They started to have fewer children. They tended to generally live longer, and they started to tend to live healthier lives. They started to wear, for example, shorter dresses, right? And something that would never have been, they never would have been seen in 1900 or 1890. They started to wear more makeup. They started to dance to the latest dance crazes, like the Charleston was a popular dance in the 1920s. And they generally assumed, women did, that they would have the same, and they did have the same political and social rights as their husbands or any man would. Okay? So because of popular magazines of the day, other sociological studies that were done, books that were written, movies that were being made, all of these tended to slowly change the role of women in U.S. society. They tended to reject everything in the Victorian Age. And the symbol of women during this time was known as the flapper. The flapper was a young woman. She wore short skirts. She had a lot of makeup on her face, on her cheeks. Many times they had shorter haircuts, cropped really close, or maybe in a bob. So the idea that there were two separate spheres here between men and women really got a lot narrower during the 1920s. Appliances like electric irons, vacuum cleaners, all those things made women's lives easier, right? Because they were still stereotyped as the person who would be using those things in the home, but it did allow for more leisure time, more charitable work, more personal or new personal interests. And these changes in society tended to be felt more by women who, again, lived in cities or at least in the suburbs rather than rural women. Okay, so be able to explain maybe one or two ways how women's roles are changing during the 1920s as well. And like I said, the symbol, you can see a few of them here in the photograph. The symbol of women's roles changing was played out in the flapper. We have three flappers here. These tended to be women, usually under the age of 30 or maybe even 25. And they rejected everything about the Victorian age. So they basically rejected everything that their mother had gone through, if you want to look at it that way, from a generation earlier. They wore, like I said, the short skirts. They cut their hair very short, called the bob. They followed all the dance crazes. These were the people who were enjoying much of the pop culture, the new pop culture of the day, too. And the decade saw many firsts for women. We already know that in 1920, women gained the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Many more women were entering the workforce as well, because many more women were becoming educated, either by graduating from not just high school, but also pursuing perhaps a college degree. Many more moved into fields that were typically reserved, quote unquote, reserved for men, like banking, aviation. The famous female pilot Amelia Earhart is an example of that. Journalism, medicine. More women were going into medicine as well. And you also had some going into politics. Your book talks about a woman, Nellie Taylor Ross was the first woman to become governor of any state in Wyoming. And other firsts included, you had a first female judge, you had the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate. So there were many breakthroughs that took place for women during the 1920s. The 1920s saw also an impact on the arts and literature, and what was being written about, how society was being reflected in some of the more famous works of literature and art of the 1920s. And there really is no area of American life that reflected the impact of World War I more so than the literature and the arts during the 1920s. The war altered the way that writers and artists viewed the world. It forced them to change the way they wrote or the way they painted, for example. And World War I called really this whole idea of progress into question. All the new modernist innovations and inventions and materialism, and it really called all this progress. Is this really the best thing for America? They address questions like, how could a society that's ruled by progress, for example, embark on a war during World War I that would kill millions of people, destroy civilizations, left survivors hungry, homeless, and helpless. Many writers and people who lived during the World War I era basically came to the conclusion that this was not an action of rational people. And this is what the new generation of writers in the 20s argued many times in their works of literature. In other words, going to war and leaving this situation in the world was not a decision made by rational but irrational people. And many times that's what their books talked about. Modernism was expressed more as a skeptical or pessimistic view of the world, right? So they called into question the materialism and all these new innovations, and is this really good? What's going on? You also had writers and artists exploring the ideas of the famous psychologist Sigmund Freud, who had suggested that human behavior was driven by unconscious desires. Freud argued that much of human behavior is driven not by rational thought, but by our unconsciousness. Okay? So when you put these two together, you have the makings for a lot of themes, different themes, that came through in a lot of famous writers from this era through their works, like an F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby. Okay, but looking at art first, one of the more famous painters of the 20s was a painter named Edward Hopper. Others included Joseph Stella, Georgia O'Keeffe was extremely famous. But Edward Hopper, here's one of his famous ones named Chop Suey. And many times in his works of art, and this was a common theme, where tradition was being challenged, right? Where painters would experiment with new subjects and very abstract styles. Modernism, what was going on in the country, would again clash head-on with traditionalism, and it would do that probably any more so than in the field of art. And this is an example of what you may have seen in the 1920s. As far as art goes, and I would urge you to maybe Google sometime Edward Hopper, and you'll notice all the different kinds of paintings. They're all going to look similar to what you see here. Many times his paintings included very serene scenes where there were just maybe a couple of people, and that's the case here. But what the point of this is that he was challenging the traditional themes and ideals and values of the Victorian era. And another one you might want to look up is Edward Hopper's Automat. And I think another one might be called The Diner. That's a famous one too. As far as literature goes, the writers of the 1920s were known as the Lost Generation. That was their nickname because they no longer had the faith they believed in all the cultural ideals and guidelines of the Victorian era. They were lost. Many were inspired by their quote-unquote lost condition in search for what they called a newfound truth and fresh ways of expressing that truth. And it's argued that this was probably the one era in American history that saw the most emerging great writers and literary talents probably in all of American history. The list includes, I already mentioned, F. Scott Fitzgerald writing The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway, all of his novels, especially that deal with World War I, Edith Wharton, Sinclair Lewis, William Faulkner, the list goes on and on and on. T.S. Eliot is another one. And you can see here, many of Fitzgerald's books explores the idea of the American dream, writing that his generation had found all faiths in man shaken. And there are themes like this that come out in The Great Gatsby. I think you might be reading that in English right now, or you are going to read it, or maybe you guys are done already. But you're going to be talking about the themes of The Great Gatsby. Ernest Hemingway questioned everything there was about World War I, the idea of personal sacrifice, the glorification of war. He created a whole new style of writing. And it wasn't just writing and literature, but also, theatrical plays as well. The famous playwright Eugene O'Neill, all right, is one of those examples. And O'Neill was influenced by Sigmund Freud and the subconscious mind and human behavior. So in many of his plays, those themes come out. So hopefully you've taken something away from the video here, from the lecture here, and what pop culture meant, what mass media meant, and how American society is changing, the influence that pop culture had on American society in many different ways, right? We had the radio, the impact of the radio. We had impacts in literature and arts. We had the invention of the phonograph, the record player, how those inventions are impacting society. So hopefully you got and watched the videos. That's all that I've got for you here in 7.4. Okay, so this is going to be kind of part 1. Because there will also be a video then for 7.5, which is on the Harlem Renaissance and the rise of the African American culture. Okay, thanks guys for watching. We will talk to you soon. Bye for now.